Today, we're going to talk about the two main ways that you can go about improving ankle mobility as it relates to lifting weights. Just before we dive into things a little bit more deeply, first things first, we need to talk a little bit about the structure of the ankle and what the anatomy of the ankle is actually like. Much like the elbow, the ankle is a hinge joint primarily, which means that it really only pivots in one main direction. People often get the ankle confused with the rest of the foot, which moves in many different directions through actions called pronation and supination. For now, we're really just going to stick to focusing on the ankle, and the ankle does two main things. It dorsiflexes and it plantar flexes. You can think of dorsiflexion as pulling your toes to your face, and you can think of plantar flexion as the exact opposite, i.e. anything like a calf raise type motion. Now, one of the main things to keep in mind when we're talking about mobility in general is the conversation around structure, and specifically how structure provides end ranges and boundaries to motion. We are not Gumby-like, stick-like figures that are meant to move in any and all directions infinitely. You can't improve your mobility beyond a specific point, given that bones run into bones, muscles are no longer able to contract because they're fully shortened, ligaments are fully stretched, etc. So just as we go through these different things, keep in mind that your range of mobility should be specific to you and no one else. No one has your exact morphology. Although we can take a look at textbooks and look at joint ranges of motion, what might be considered normal, those are all averages based on specific populations that are not you. So now that we got that sort of introductory stuff out of the way, method number one is improving range of motion through contraction. A lot of people try to stretch their way into good ankle mobility, but I find that the results from stretching ankles are really short term in terms of their benefit. In my opinion, a much better alternative is to actually work the primary muscles of the ankle through their full ranges of motion. Now again, because the ankle is a hinge joint, we're really only going to be training it in two different directions, which are ultimately part of the same range. In other words, we're really just performing one motion and loading that motion in opposite directions. So three main exercises that I really like for improving contraction around muscles of the ankle. Number one, the seated calf raise. Number two, the straight knee calf raise. And number three, the dorsiflexion, i.e. the anterior tib raise. Seated calf raises and straight knee calf raises are fairly straightforward in their execution. All that you really want to keep in mind as you're going through the calf raises is that you're actually supposed to be putting pressure through the balls of your feet or just under them. I find that a lot of people just push through their toes and start to claw whatever platform they're using. So whether you're doing a seated calf raise or a straight knee calf raise on a leg press or on a hack squat or something similar, or maybe you're just standing and doing it body weight, make sure you're pushing through the balls of your feet and not necessarily the front of the toes. The reason it's important to do both the seated and the straight knee calf raise is because the limitation that the gastrocnemius, i.e. the calf that crosses the knee, will create also limits the range of motion of the ankle. So in one instance, because you're doing seated calf raises, you'll be able to get farther up into what's called dorsiflexion, like we mentioned earlier, and farther down potentially into plantar flexion. In the instance of the straight knee calf raise, you'll be able to stretch the actual gastroc a little bit more so that it gains an ability to actually control motion in its fully lengthened position. And in the seated calf raise, you'll be able to do the opposite, meaning that the gastroc, right, that outer calf that crosses the knee, will fully shorten. The soleus muscle, which sits underneath of the gastroc, will fully stretch and fully shorten whenever you move your ankle in either one of these ranges because it only crosses the ankle. It has no length change at the knee. So after you've done your seated and your straight knee calf raises, again, which you can do pretty much on any seated calf machine, and then for the straight knee, you can do on any leg press, hack squat, or just regular standing calf raises, what you're going to want to do is train dorsiflexion. Now, my personal favorite way to do this is simply just to have a machine. Some commercial gyms will give you access to what's called the tibialis raise machine, which is basically just a machine where you actually wedge your feet inside of the contraption itself, and all you do is basically just dorsiflexion, but many gyms don't have this machine. So if you're really serious about your ankle training, you can either buy one for cheap on Amazon somewhere between $40 and $60 or something like that, or what you could do is an alternative where you simply use a dumbbell and support the dumbbell on the end of your toes as you go through the motion. A good introduction to this motion also might just be a body weight type of dorsiflexion motion, either just, you know, with your foot hanging off of a bench and you're pausing in that fully contracted dorsiflex position. To be honest, as long as you're improving the contraction ability of both the calves as well as the muscles that pull up on the front side of the ankle, the main ones being the tibialis anterior as well as some of the other extensor digitorum muscles which sit and run through the front side of the toes, you will gain the mobility that you are supposed to have and no more and no less. Again, shoving yourself into certain joint positions that you're not actually capable of achieving from a structural standpoint is only going to work against you in the long run. Okay, so that's method number one. Now what's method number two? If you don't want to to do any of that, which is, to be honest, completely fine, you can simply just use heel wedges in all of your ankle limiting motions. So for example, if you're doing squats and you find that when you get to a certain depth, your ankles sort of just feel like your calves are trying to basically limit you from falling over, and you're feeling discomfort somewhere in your ankle and your feet are crashing down. Assuming technique is sound, what you can simply do is put something underneath of your heel so that your ankle starts in a relatively greater amount of plantar flexion, i.e. the front of the ankle is more open, so that you can move into more dorsiflexion relative to what you might in terms of the total range of motion in that particular exercise. So what I'll personally do is I'll use the Prime Solo wedges that I have at my gym, but if I don't have access to those, what I'll do is I'll actually just use a plate or something similar to elevate the heels so that my heels are higher than my toes. This works out really, really well for a lot of people because they don't need to spend a bunch of extra time stretching their ankles. And to be honest, a lot of the time people who have structural limitations won't be able to improve very much from the standpoint of the contraction improvement if, again, they do have heavy structural limitations that simply just prevent their tibia from moving over their foot very much. The reason that the heel elevation works so well is, again, as I mentioned earlier, because it actually starts you in a more plantar flex position, but also because it increases the distance between the knee and the floor. What this does is it actually makes your tibia artificially longer, meaning that the proportion of your tibia effectively becomes greater relative to your femur. This is often most helpful in motions that you're trying to do mostly for your quads, specifically during squatting, because it's very helpful for the knees to be able to bend fully and to move farther away from the center of mass, again, when you're trying to target more quads. So just to summarize, the two main ways to improve ankle range of motion in the gym: number one, train the muscles that move the ankle, pretty simple, and number two, use a heel elevation, whether it be a Prime Solo wedge or something a little bit more simple, like a plate underneath of your heel, or just something similar like a mat or anything basically that you can put your heels on. If you like this video and you want to learn more from me, definitely check out my full online biomechanics course, which includes 15+ hours of video content demonstrating everything from exercise selection, execution to 3D anatomy and structural demonstrations.